I want to start off with a small text that comes to us from the book of Acts, first chapter, verse 3, in which Jesus, after his death, his resurrection, he's with the disciples. It's before his ascension. And it says in this small verse, after his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. And the key portions of this are the convincing proofs that he was alive. Now we're going to park that, but as I speak to you this evening, hopefully you're going to see some living proofs of the fact that Jesus is alive in the 21st century and down through history in ways that are remarkable, astounding, and show God's goodness not just to his own people, but his general grace to humanity through those who believe in him, his teachings, and seek to live a life that gives honor to Jesus. Well, I want to start off with this little virus. It's 300 by 250 nanometers in size, which is incredibly small. But trust me, ladies and gentlemen, it packs an incredibly powerful and dangerous punch. This is variola vera. It's the smallpox virus. When this is breathed in to the mouth and into the throat and down into the lungs, it embeds itself there. And then this virus starts to multiply and it gets into the local lymph nodes and then will spread through the circulatory system to all of the human body. Now, the first sign that somebody has smallpox occurs when you start to get these lesions on your tongue, on the roof of your mouth, and in the back of your throat. Within a short period of time after this, some 24 to 48 hours, a whole lot of large liquid-filled blisters appear over your body. Incredibly painful, and if you were to survive this, you will be scarred for the rest of your life. This is a picture of a young girl in Bangladesh in the 1970s suffering from a full-blown infection from variola vera, or the smallpox virus. Now, smallpox is one of the most deadliest diseases in human history. It's painful, it's a scourge, it has an incredibly lethal mortality rate. What does that mean? It means that whoever it infects, it's likely to kill in large numbers. And so if we think about the adult populations that get hit by the smallpox virus, the mortality rate is between 30 to 60% of those people will die. For children, it's even higher. Up to 80% of children who are infected with smallpox will lose their lives. And if the unfortunate victim should survive the horrors of this experience, they will often be scarred for the rest of their lives, as I suggested earlier, but they will also suffer potentially a loss of sight and a loss of hearing. Now, the earliest known example of a smallpox infection comes to us from 3,000 years ago and the mummified remains of Ramesses V in Egypt. When they opened up his coffin and they found his mummified body, it had this type of smallpox scarring all over the skin. When smallpox arrived with Christopher Columbus and Europeans from the old world into the new world in the 16th century, it had a devastating impact on this virgin field indigenous population. It's estimated that something like 90% of the population was removed from the Americas due to smallpox. Now, this means that in a country like Mexico, when the conquistadors arrived, first, there was some 30 million people, demographers estimate, in Mexico. By the time 50 years had passed, it was down to 3 million. And this was largely due to things like, and principally by, smallpox. We also know that in Europe, smallpox would come through in waves. And it's estimated in the 18th century, for which we have kind of really lots of documents and church records in Europe, that about 400,000 souls every single year were wiped off planet Earth via smallpox, variola vera. 400,000 every single year, including 5 reigning monarchs. And about a third of all cases of blindness were attributable to smallpox infections. And then when you get into the 20th century, the one I was born into, some of you I think maybe a little bit later, some of my era, but in the 20th century, scientists and medical experts tell us about 500 million people lost their lives to smallpox. To give you some kind of way you can measure that, if you think about the COVID shutdown and the impact of COVID on Western society and globally, it's estimated that maybe the loss of life was up to maybe 7 million. But of course, there are other things that are going on there as well. So it might be less than that. But it gives you some kind of a comparison here between COVID and what we're talking about here with smallpox. And remember, it's 80% of children who get infected lose their lives. So it was massive. So 500 million people. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, Adam, I haven't even heard of smallpox. Some of you will be thinking that tonight. And that is because, and you're probably not losing any sleep over the possibility of a smallpox infection, and that is because of an amazing scientific field called immunology. And I want you to say this with me, immunology. We'll do it another time, but pretend you're a Pentecostal. Immunology, that's a lot better. And so immunology, the scientific field, had vaccines, of course, and they began in the 1980s, they began this massive eradication program to get rid of smallpox. And guess what? Nobody today on planet Earth suffers this kind of fate. The only place smallpox exists now is in a handful of laboratories around the world. But you no longer need to fear the great scourge of humanity. Why? Because it has been obliterated, ladies and gentlemen. Wow. That's an incredible achievement. Immunology, vaccines. How does this all fit into what if Jesus had never been born? Well, you're about to find out. It's a journey we're going to take of discovery. You know, over the last 2 decades, it's become quite popular and people have become quite enamored with the idea that religion, and in the West in particular, Christianity, as a belief and a practice has been detrimental to humankind and to the development of civilization. In other words, there are people out there today, you may know some of these people, you may be lectured to by some of these people, you may have friends that are some of these people who kind of believe that the world would be a better place if Jesus had never been born. Now, the most vociferous exponents of this view, the popularizers of it, the propagandists of this, are the so-called new atheists. You may have heard of them. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, to name a few of them. And I'm going to look at 2 of these individuals that are going to illustrate this very position, that it might have been better if Jesus had never been born and his church had never been established. One of these is, of course, Richard Dawkins, the kind of leader of this gang. In 2007, he wrote a book called The God Delusion. You may have heard of this, the idea that people who believe in God are simply deluded, ladies and gentlemen. And it's my job as Richard Dawkins to remove that ignorance from you, remove the scales from your eyes. And this is what Richard Dawkins had to say. In fact, I'm going to start off with Christopher Hitchens. So Chris Hitchens, he's no longer with us. He passed away. He was a very good essayist, a very good raconteur, great public speaker, very well known for his liberal views. And he wrote a book. So Richard wrote The God Delusion. Our man, Chris Hitchens, he wrote a book called God, you can't make this stuff up, God is Not Great. How Religion Poisons Everything. God is not great. Did you folks know you were going to hear any of this stuff tonight at a Christian church? Let's see where all this goes. It's kind of scary, isn't it? God is not great. How religion poisons, listen to this word, Everything. This is what Chris Hitchens had to say. He said, invested in ignorance, hostile to free inquiry, coercive towards children, organized religion ought to have a great deal on its conscience. What did Richard Dawkins say in his book, The God Delusion? In this short piece of text I'm going to show you, he compares the achievements of the great God, perhaps of the 21st century, science, with that of theology. And he's going to talk about how science has delivered X, Y, and Z, and that Christianity and organized religion has really offered nothing of any substance, and perhaps probably has misled people. This is what he had to say in this short text. Here's our man, Richard Dawkins, and he said, science has eradicated smallpox, can immunize against most previously deadly viruses, can kill most previously deadly bacteria. Theology, the belief in God, the study of God, has done nothing but talk of pestilence as the wages of sin. What a contrast. Science, ladies and gentlemen, has done so many wondrous and great things, but what has the church ever done that has been of benefit to humankind? And he's quite confident in this position. Now, because the new atheists argue that because of all this, the new atheists argue that we'd be better off that Jesus had never been born and his church never established. But to your great relief and to the pastors of this church, tonight I'm going to challenge that position as a historian by stating boldly that we are in fact vastly better off because of the birth of Jesus and the establishment of his church. I'm going to repeat that. We are vastly better off because Jesus was born and his church was established. And I propose to do this across 4 areas of our lives and civilization. The first is the sanctity of life. The second is healthcare. The third, ladies and gentlemen, is education. And the fourth, believe it or not, sacre bleu, a caramba, is science itself. And you say, Adam, can you really do all that in the time that you've got? Just watch me. Let's see how we go. I have no idea. It's an adventure for me as well. Let's have a look at this. I want to turn to ideas around sanctity of life. Do you know, it was very dangerous to be born in the Greco-Roman world that Jesus was born into in the first century. You didn't really want to be conceived in that period because your life was so precarious. Children were often abandoned in that society. Sick or unwanted babies were commonly left in the woods, either to die of exposure or to be devoured by animals. All deformed children in this period were abandoned, and often female babies were abandoned by poor families because they felt that they were not as economically valuable as boys. This is what we call infanticide. It is the killing of children that have been born, and it was as common as breathing is for you today in this period. I want to give you a nice example of this. Well, it's not a nice example, is it? But it's an example of this that illustrates this very point. This is a letter from a Roman male to his wife, and they already have a baby, a boy, and she is pregnant. She's about to deliver another child, and he's in this kind of Egypt, Alexandria area, and this is what he had to say to her in this letter. But what I want you to notice is the very casual way in which infanticide is introduced into the discussion as though it was nothing. Know that I am still in Alexandria. So it's a Roman citizen, first century. Know that I'm still in Alexandria. I ask and beg you to take good care of our baby son. As soon as I receive payment, I shall send it to you. If you are delivered before I come home, if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, discard it. This wasn't something you could be punished for, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, the law allowed this sort of behavior. A child's life was almost worthless compared to how we venerate and look after children today in comparison, this idea of sanctity of life. And this means because of this rampant infanticide, about only half the children ever lived to the age of 8 in the Roman world. And this was due to the fact that killing your own child was not considered murder. In fact, a Roman father could take the life of their own child. A Roman father could sell their child into slavery. A Roman father could marry their child off. And a Roman father could confiscate their property. Now, of course, when did this change? It was with the advent and the growth of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And what was different about the Christians and their attitudes towards children, unborn and born? That you should not be doing this. You see, if you think about the Judeo-Christian belief system, in the book of Genesis, God said, go forth and what? Multiply. The more children you have, the merrier. We also get expressions and phrases in the Old Testament like to have a quiver full of arrows is a good thing, speaking of children, or that children are a blessing. And then if you think about Jesus' attitude towards children, in his teaching, he says that our faith should be as of a child. When the disciples tried to send children away, he said, let these little ones come to me, and he blessed them. This was a radical different view. And if you were to look at kind of secular books on the sanctity of life and the treatment of children, you will discover that they will talk about this change in the attitudes towards children that occurred because of the spread of Christianity and then its adoption by the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. And this brought about an amazing change, led to a changing attitude towards children and encouraged ideas around sanctity of life. I want to give you an example of this from Justinian, who was a Christian emperor, who passed a very important edict in which he talks about Christian principles and puts them into law that we find in our laws today in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with regards to children that have been born. Unborn children, of course, different circumstances and often in Western society. But I want you to see this kind of principle of sanctity of life in here and how radical this is in this world. And so here's our edict from our man Justinian. He said, those who expose children, possibly hoping they would die, and those who use the potions of the abortionist are subject to the full penalty of the law, both civil and ecclesiastical, for murder. Should exposure occur, the find of the child is to see that he is baptized and that he is raised with Christian care and compassion. They may then be adopted, even as we ourselves have been adopted into the kingdom of grace. Why should these Christians, when they find these children, adopt them? He uses a scriptural, biblical rationale for this decision. God adopted us as children. So you should adopt these abandoned children. And this was radical. In addition to being radical, it was one of the reasons demographers use to kind of rationalize the rapid growth of Christianity from the 1st through the 2nd through to the 3rd century and through to the 4th century with the Emperor Constantine, where the range of numbers of Christians in the empire had gone from a few thousand in the book of Acts to, by the time we get to the 4th century, it could be as much as 10% to maybe a third of the entire population of the Roman Empire may have been Christian or certainly influenced by Christianity. So this was a massive change in this area. So we've looked at sanctity of life here and its kind of origins in Western society, then spreading globally. It has these Judeo-Christian roots deeply embedded in the teaching of Jesus and his moral character. I want us to turn and switch to healthcare, which you and I take for granted in our beautiful country. The idea of universal health care, something goes seriously wrong, you might have private insurance, but if you don't have that, ladies and gentlemen, you are going to get some kind of care in our system. But that is very different to the 1st century, the one into which Jesus was born. You know, hospitals in the 1st century, in the Roman Empire, were not in great numbers, and they were not available to everybody. So if you wanted health care in the 1st century, if you were wealthy, you could have a private physician. You could have someone come and look after you. Someone come and do a house call. But the idea of you and I rocking up to an emergency area in a local hospital, ladies and gentlemen, is not something that existed in this period. And of course, the hospitals that did exist were for the exclusive use of what were known as the useful sick. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, probably none of you would qualify for that category. So the useful sick were people who might be poor, but they had a function in society which gave them some value, and they could be accorded some kind of health care in a small hospital. The useful sick included gladiators. So if you were a member of the Blues or an All Black, you've got a good chance, ladies and gentlemen, of getting to one of these hospitals. That's kind of good, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? And then if you were a slave, you might think you're a slave. You're not in the context of the period we're talking about. You could get some kind of looking after, and if you were a soldier. If you were a manual laborer, or a poor person, you really had no place of refuge in this time. What would happen is if you became sick and you needed to be looked after and you were consuming food, of course, water, the family said, hey, we don't know if this person's going to live or not, let's push them out of the house. And so they would be pushed out of the house to see if they survived, and if they survived, they came back. If they did not, they did not. I think you can do the math here. So this really only changed this kind of attitude towards the sick and the availability of kind of hospitals with the arrival of the birth of Jesus and the establishment of this church. It really only changed after the coming of Christ. And this is because Christians were following Christ's example. I mean, it's always remarkable to me if you read something just like the Gospel of Mark. It kind of starts off with John the Baptist, the fulfillment of Isaiah, Elijah, all that sort of stuff. And then Jesus starts off his ministry after the temptation. And we often think of him preaching and everything else. But you know what accompanies all of that? All the times he is healing people. It seems like page after page, numerous people are being healed at all times. He cared for the sick. And if you think about when he said to his disciples, when you care for the least of these, my brethren, you should go visit people in hospital. You're doing it to me. His acts of healings are legion. And then, of course, his most famous parable that even people who aren't Christians know about is the one of the Good Samaritan, a man who's beaten up, who needs health care. And then the Samaritan takes him and pays for his health care in a kind of private hospital care, we could call it today. But, this kind of good acts. Where do these ideas come from? It comes from Jesus and his life. The first kind of general hospital for people comes from the 4th century, and Saint Basil, what a great name, Saint Basil of Caesarea in the 4th century. I want to give you an example of, let's have a look at our slide here. I want to give you an example of the oldest functioning hospital in the world today, almost continuously from the 6th century, so from 600 AD. This, of course, is in the amazing city of Paris. I'm on the left-hand side here. How can you tell it's me? The chicken legs. And, when you go to Paris, one of the things you do is you have to go to the Notre Dame Cathedral, right? Because it's so magnificent and you go in there and you love it. But in that same area, when you're looking at the front of the cathedral, if you just turn to the left, you would see Hotel Dio. Hotel Dio. You can see it on the top of the archway there. That means Hotel God. That is a hospital that has been running since 600 AD, 1,400 years, providing health care to the rich and poor of Paris. You see, the thing about the Christians that made them really different to everybody else is they didn't just look after themselves. They believed as Christians they should be helping people who weren't Christians. They should be helping people who were unbelievers, maybe even looking after people who did not like them. I want to give you an example of this from Julian the Apostate, one of the emperors that came after Constantine. So after Constantine, nearly all the emperors were Christian of one kind or another, whether we would call them, the born-again Christians of the Christian West or Pentecostalism or, Protestant church. It doesn't. They would consider themselves to be in this Christian tradition. And but there was one that came along called Julian, who said, you know what we need to do, and what I'd like to do, is I'd like to push Christianity aside, and I'd like to renew the religion of worshipping the pagan, and I don't mean that as a pejorative, it's just as a descriptor, the non-Christian gods, or this pantheon of gods in the Roman Empire. But he realized there was a real problem with this. And it was the Christians, which sometimes they're called the Galileans. And it was that the Galileans were hugely successful in kind of recruitment because of their healthcare and looking after people outside of their own little select holy huddle. And look at what Julian the Apostate had to say. He said, if we're going to be successful in all this, this is what we're going to have to do. He said, those impious Galileans, why did he call them impious? Because they wouldn't worship the empire, they wouldn't worship Jupiter, Athena, etc. These impious Galileans, not only do they feed their own poor, but ours also, welcoming them into their agape. These are a love meal, communal feast. You have got to start looking after the sick people and the poor because the Christians are doing this. He recognized that one of the reasons for the success of Christianity was because of the way they cared for people, not just themselves, but others around them. And it was absolutely radical. In addition to this, in addition to these hospitals that you and I enjoy all today, we have non-governmental organizations. I want to talk to you about Henri Denor, who you can see here. He was a Swiss banker, he was a philanthropist, he was a Christian, and in 1859 he was on a trip to see Napoleon III during the Italian Wars of Unification. And as he was on this journey, he came across a battlefield strewn with the dead, but in amongst the dead were a whole lot of people who had been wounded in the battle and had just been abandoned there. He felt that he needed to stop his journey, and he started to care for these people. He co-opted people in their houses. He co-opted local churches, and he got them to look after the wounded that were there. And guess what happened? Many of the people who would have died lived because of this modicum of care. He wrote about this in a book that was published in 1862, which you probably haven't read. Neither have I, but I'm going to quote from a good part of it that kind of fits in with what we want to talk about here tonight. It dawned on him that it was really God that had called him to do this. He said, in this state of pent-up emotion which filled my heart, I was aware of an intuition, vague and yet profound, that my work was to be an instrument of His will. It seemed to me that I had to accomplish it as a sacred duty, and that it was destined to have fruits of infinite consequence for all mankind. And what was the organization he established, ladies and gentlemen? It was the International Red Cross. And millions of people around the world have felt the benefits of that organization and others that are directly based on and copy the International Red Cross, like the Green Crescent, or other organizations that you might donate money to. It all kinds of comes from Henri Denor and this compelling from God to go and do this. Millions of lives potentially saved by the existence of the Red Cross and other organizations that follow him. In addition to this, you're saying, Adam, is there more? Yes, there is, ladies and gentlemen. And the first person who phones through in the next 5 minutes get a free set of steak knives as well. Anyway, what I wanted to say was, think about missionaries, medical missionaries. These are people who have been trained in places like New Zealand. They might be a dentist, they might be a surgeon, they might be a nurse. They could be any of these sorts of roles and others, and they have a job here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and they feel this compelling urge to go to a country that doesn't have free Wi-Fi, doesn't have hot running water, doesn't have all the accoutrements and luxuries of the modern Western world, and they decide to put their career in New Zealand on hold, probably missing out on all kinds of promotions and everything else, to live in a place that's more dangerous, less comfortable, and potentially in the past with the possibility of losing their own life. Who would do that, ladies and gentlemen? Well, maybe you have a transcendent cause. Maybe you have a higher calling. Christians have done it in their tens of thousands, across the 19th and 20th centuries and into the 21st century. Some of you might be a medical missionary here tonight. But I want to read to you from a pamphlet written by a medical missionary about why they actually go to these places when they could live comfortably here in the Western world, but want to sacrifice part of their life in the proclamation of the gospel, but in principally to caring for other people. This medical missionary pamphlet says that Christ said go, but he also said go heal. Did he only heal as signs of his power, or for the relief of those whom he came to seek and save? Primarily for the latter. In point of fact, his deeds of healing were often done in secret, and evidently therefore as signs, not therefore as signs at all, but to prove his willingness to do good as proofs of his love, but not his power at all. And of course, if you read the Gospels, there's one thing that comes very clear about why Jesus says what he says and does what he does, including the healing of the sick. You will, on numerous occasions, find this one word associated with all of those actions. Starts with C, ladies and gentlemen, it's compassion. Jesus was moved with compassion in this situation. Jesus was moved in compassion in other situations. And Christians, called by his name, baptized in his Spirit, still feel that same call of compassion, and thank goodness they have, because it's made a massive difference in many countries. As late as 1935, Christian missionaries ran half of the hospitals in China. 1935. And let's see what the impact of this has been on the general population and life expectancy across the 20th century. In the first century, the average lifespan around Jesus' time was about 28 years of age. Today, it is close to 70 and beyond. And the good deal of the success is due to what? The spread of public hospitals, NGOs like the Red Cross, and of course, the tens of thousands of medical missionaries that have given parts of their lives and sometimes their entire lives to serving people in the developing world. Incredible, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely incredible. This brings me on to education. Do you know, in Jesus' day, formal education was rare. If you were part of the aristocracy, if you were a high-level bureaucrat or going to be a high-level bureaucrat, if you were going to be a general or an admiral in some kind of military service, you would be well educated. But the hoi polloi, the great unwashed, you and I would be, unless you've got some aristocrat, you've got some royal blood in you, ladies and gentlemen, and you can just come see me afterwards if that's the case, I'm interested. But do you know what I'm saying here, folks? You just wouldn't have any education. You would be illiterate. In the past, it was social status, it was wealth. These were the significant factors that determined whether you ever learnt to read or write or had any form of education. And this did not change largely until the 16th century and one of the most important events in human history. It's known as the Protestant Reformation. It radically transformed these sorts of ideas and expanded education out to everybody. One of the great proponents of this was a man called Calvin, who in Geneva promoted education for everyone. And this became a pattern throughout the world, even until our day. And why was this? Why was it so important for Protestants that everybody should be able to read? It was because the Protestant rebellion against Rome at that time had begun out of what? Biblical study and interpretation. And so it was obvious to Protestant leaders that if the reform was to continue that they had initiated and was to flourish, everyone should be literate at all levels of society. And we can see this with the Puritans when they turned up in the Americas. We're going to look at the old Deluder Act that was passed by the Puritans about the general population having an education. And it's called the Old Deluder Act because it's a reference to Satan. Of 1647, it being one chief project of that old deluder to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures, it is therefore ordered in every township in this jurisdiction, after the Lord had increased them to 50 households, shall forthwith appoint one within their town to teach all such children as shall resort to him to write and read, whose wages shall be paid either by the parents or the masters of such children, or by the inhabitants in general. So this idea of educating children, and universally, everybody should have an education, that you take for granted today, was part of this radical transformation out of the Protestant Revolution. This is also true of the great institutions of learning that some of you might have been to or are planning to go to. This is Oxford University. I've been in this building. No corners, ladies and gentlemen. This kind of library in the ground floor there. And, the universities of the world, they find their roots in what? Christian cathedral schools and monasteries of the Middle Ages. And if you've ever been to a graduation, I was just at one a week ago, and I get to put on my gown, this big, long, black gown. I really love it, folks. And then I have these flashings on the front. This is a kind of, it's called a Panoni red, I think. And it's fantastic. And then I've got a hood, which is an arts one, because, my terminal degree, why is it called a terminal degree? It nearly killed me. That I have this hood representing that. And then I get to wear a doctoral bonnet. And that kind of sounds strange, but it's wonderful. And when you're a student, you come in and you're wearing your gown and you've got your hood, you've got your mortarboard. Where does all that come from? Have you ever thought about it? It's a monk's habit from the Middle Ages. The gown, the hood, that's where it comes from. You're walking in when you go to graduate in a tradition that stretches all the way back to like the 6th, 7th, 8th century. And the first university that gets established is the University of Bologna in Italy, established in 1158. Then we've got Paris, then we've got Oxford, then we've got Cambridge, all got Christian origins. This is true for the Americas as well. In 1932, they did a survey of the 200 colleges and universities in America at that time. They found that 92% of them, catch this folks, 92% of them were created by a Christian denomination. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, William and Mary, University of California, Berkeley, Dartmouth, Duke, Georgetown, all have these Christian roots. And what has been the result of the spreading of education and higher education? It has transformed literacy rates around the world. They did a survey in 1900, and they found that the world could be divided into 3 main areas around literacy, the ability to read and write. 3 different groupings. The first were the non-Christian countries in which Christianity had not made a big impact at all. Literacy rates were around 0 to 20%. In some countries, it was just the very elite that could actually read and nobody else. Then they found that in Catholic countries, amazing, 40 to 60% literacy rate. That's incredible, folks. It's estimated in the 1st century in the Roman Empire, probably less than 10% of the population could read. But look at this at the beginning of the 20th century. And then in Protestant countries, it was 94 to 99% could read and could write. Amazing. And this brings me to my last area. But can you see how Christians who have been faithful to the calling of the Lord in these kinds of areas have made a magnificent difference to the quality of life that every one of us has experienced, and I bet you took for granted just as I did until I realized all this. I want to end with the scientific revolution. We need to go back where we started, don't we? The Protestant Reformation not only greatly enhanced the opportunity of everyone to get an education, it led to one of the biggest changes in human history It was an event called the Scientific Revolution. The Scientific Revolution, which you and I are heavily indebted to and enjoy the fruits and benefits of in everything that we do. The sound system, this building, these lights, the cameras, your car, all of that kind of stuff, and then the medical equipment that is used to save your life at one time or another in a hospital that finds its roots back in Christianity, comes from the scientific revolution. Modern science was born out of Christianity. Science is the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the natural world through observation and experimentation. The scientific revolution arose out of Christianity. Richard Dawkins, less aware of this. It grew out of Christians who had two important belief systems in their theology that did not exist in non-Christian societies. The first is this. They believed that an intelligent God whose creation was governed by understandable and unchangeable laws. Understandable and unchangeable laws. This is what these Christians said. They said God gave us the 10 Commandments. These are spiritual laws to govern our lives. What if God has laws that govern the behavior of the natural world? And what could we do if we discovered those laws? C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature because of a belief in a lawgiver. It was not the non-Christian societies of the pre-scientific revolution that discovered the laws, but it was in this Christian world. But I want you to think about these laws that were discovered because of these Christian beliefs. Think about the laws of gravity, thermodynamics, motion, electromagnetism, radiation, chemistry. It rose out of these Christians, ladies and gentlemen. And you know, one of the other things that they believed in is that the Protestants believed in the fall in Genesis, and in particular in Romans, where Paul said, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, thus death spread to all men. So these Protestants believed not just your ailments and the diseases that afflicted you and the weeds that grew in the ground were because of the fall, but in actual fact, the fall had corrupted our minds, which meant that you could not trust your intuition, that your thoughts could be wrong. You might have an idea, but it could be wrong. Why did they believe that? Because of the fall. Which means that if you have a thought, the Protestant scientific revolutionaries said, guess what you should do with that thought? Do you know what a thought is, ladies, in the academic world, ladies and gentlemen? It's a hypothesis or it's a thesis. And do you know how you can tell if your hypothesis or thesis is right? You can't just trust your mind, according to these people. You have to run an experiment. And then you adjust your hypothesis to meet the findings of the experiment, and then you do another experiment, then you do another experiment. Where did the experiment come from, systematically applied, that makes modern science modern science? It comes from Romans and the book of Genesis. Truly, these people were deeply steeped in Christian beliefs, and they said, we need to test it. I'm going to give you a list of Christians who were scientists. Notice how I didn't say Christian scientists, because then I'd have to put Tom Cruise on the list. But Scientology. But let's just have a look at this list here of people who founded academic fields who were Christians. I'm a historian, right? But I didn't invent history. I'm standing on the shoulders of everyone from Herodotus and Thucydides right through to the modern day. But these are people who founded these fields. And they're Christians. Antiseptic surgery, Joseph Lister. Bacteriology, Louis Pasteur. Calculus, Isaac Newton. Celestial mechanics, Johannes Kepler. Chemistry, Robert Boyle. Dimensional analysis, Lord Rowley. Dynamics, Isaac Newton. Electronics, John Ambrose Fleming. Electrodynamics, James Clerk Maxwell. Electromagnetics, Michael Faraday. Energetics, Lord Kelvin. Fluid mechanics, George Stokes. Galactic astronomy, Sir William Herschel. Gas dynamics, Robert Boyle. Genetics, Gregor Mendel, hydrostatics, Blaise Pascal, immunology, Edward Jenner. What? Hold on here. Immunology was founded by a Christian? That can't be right. Because I thought all the Christians did was talk about pestilence as the wages of sin. I think you now know that's wrong. Because Christians actually set up hospitals to care for the sick. Christians establish non-governmental organizations to care for the sick. Christian missionaries have traveled all around the world to care for the sick. They don't just talk about sickness as the wages of our sin or anything like that, ladies and gentlemen. They go out and follow what Jesus said. But we have the founder of immunology, a man called Edward Jenner. Let's have a look at this individual. Edward Jenner, who was he? He was an English physician in the 18th and early 19th century. He was a scientist and a pioneer of, catch this, the smallpox vaccine. Jenner noted that milkmaids, I don't know if you know what a milkmaid is, ladies and gentlemen, but it's a woman who goes out and milks a cow and provides it for your rice bubbles or cornflakes. A milkmaid. They found that milkmaids were generally immune to smallpox. From this he postulated, or theorized, that the milkmaids exposed to the pus from cowpox, a related virus but far less dangerous, protected them from smallpox. This he tested without any ethics approval from Auckland University on 23 subjects and found that the protective cowpox pus could be effectively inoculated from person to person, not just directly from cattle. And because of his work, it is generally believed by many people that his discovery leading to immunology, he coins the phrase vaccine, that's where it comes from, Edward Jenner. He saved more lives than any other human being that has ever lived. Edward Jenner, a Christian. He's the founder of this field. And just before his death, he reflected on the attitudes of some people to his work and the God who had motivated what he did in his vocation. And this is what he had to say. It's very revealing. He said, I'm not surprised that men are not grateful to me, but I wonder that they're not grateful to God for the good he has made me the instrument of conveying to my fellow creatures. Wow. I want to conclude with, if Jesus had never been born, I think the lives of children would be cut short by widely practiced infanticide. The great masses of the world's population would have no access to health care of any kind. Whole regions would be uneducated and illiterate. And we would never have had the benefits of the modern scientific revolution. What did Jesus have to say? And what did he do, I should say? After his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs he was alive. How do we know that Jesus is alive today in the 21st century? I believe in part we can know, not just on our own personal experience, but the convincing proofs are of his followers who down through 2 millennia have taken his life and teaching so seriously, and they have blessed the rest of humanity with it. I want to conclude, is it really reasonable or accurate to say that Christianity poisons everything, that it's hostile to free inquiry, and that theology has done nothing but talk of illness as the wages of sin? Listen, our brief survey tonight, we covered a lot of ground. You were amazing. Thank you for your concentration. Our brief survey of the sanctity of life, health care, education and science itself, I strongly believe, means that this is grossly inaccurate. And of all of this produces all kinds of wonders. the world is an infinitely better place because Jesus was born and his church was established. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.